In the early days of January 1991, long before the first bombs fell and long before the world would watch green night vision footage of explosions over Baghdad, something far more unsettling was already happening inside the minds of Iraqi military planners, because they knew a storm was coming. They knew the United States and its allies were preparing a massive air campaign, and they believed they were ready for it, with thousands of anti-aircraft guns, radar stations, and surface-to-air missiles spread across the country, all designed to turn the skies into a deadly trap for any aircraft bold enough to fly into Iraqi airspace. And yet, hidden somewhere beyond the horizon, there was something they could not see, something they could not track, and something that would soon make all of those defenses feel useless. This was the F-117 Nighthawk, a jet so strange that when it was first revealed to the public, many people thought it looked like it came from a science fiction movie rather than a real air force, with sharp angles, flat surfaces, and a shape that seemed designed more by a mathematician than an engineer. And that was not far from the truth, because this aircraft was built around one idea that would change warfare forever: invisibility, not in the literal sense, but in a way that mattered far more in modern combat. Invisibility to radar, the very eyes of air defense systems, and for decades, every nation had built its military doctrine around the belief that if you could see the enemy coming on radar, you could shoot them down before they ever reached their target. But the F-117 was designed to break that rule, to slip through the gaps, to turn the sky into a place where danger could come from nowhere. For the Iraqi military, radar was everything, because it was the backbone of their entire air defense network, a web of sensors, tracking stations, and missile batteries that could detect incoming aircraft, guide missiles toward them, and coordinate responses across vast distances. And on paper, it was one of the most sophisticated systems in the world at the time, heavily influenced by Soviet designs and layered to protect key cities like Baghdad with overlapping fields of fire. But all of that assumed one simple thing: that any attacking aircraft would show up on radar as a bright, unmistakable signal, something you could point at and say, "There it is, that's the target." And what they did not know was that the F-117 was built specifically to be almost invisible to that system, to scatter radar waves instead of reflecting them back, turning what should have been a clear blip into something so small and so confusing that it was often ignored as noise. This meant that while Iraqi commanders were busy watching their screens, waiting for the massive wave of American aircraft they knew was coming, a handful of F-117s could already be slipping through the darkness, flying straight toward the heart of the country, undetected, unseen, and unstoppable. And that idea alone was terrifying, because it meant that no matter how many missiles you had, no matter how many guns you pointed at the sky, you could still be struck without warning. And in warfare, surprise is often more powerful than any weapon. The pilots who flew the F-117 were part of one of the most secretive programs in military history, men who had trained for years in the Nevada desert, flying at night, practicing missions that could not be discussed even with their families, because until just a few years before the Gulf War, the very existence of the Nighthawk had been classified, and even then, much of what it could do remained a mystery to the public. But what mattered most was that these pilots were about to take part in something no one had ever done before: the first large-scale use of stealth aircraft in a real war, not as a gimmick, not as a test, but as the spearhead of an entire air campaign. As January 17, 1991, approached, the coalition led by the United States finalized its plan to begin Operation Desert Storm, a massive effort to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait and cripple Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. And the opening phase of that operation would depend heavily on air power, because before tanks and troops could move safely, the Iraqi air defenses had to be destroyed, their command centers blinded, their communication networks shattered. And this is where the F-117 was given a role unlike any other aircraft, because while conventional jets would strike many targets, it would be the stealth fighters that went first, flying into the most heavily defended airspace in Iraq, hitting the most important and dangerous targets, and doing so with a level of precision and survivability that seemed almost impossible at the time. What made this so extraordinary was not just the technology, but the audacity of the plan, because sending any aircraft into downtown Baghdad, one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth, was already risky, but sending them in at the very start of the war, before the defenses had been weakened, was something that only made sense if you truly believed your aircraft could not be seen. And that belief was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible, as black, angular jets lifted off into the night, carrying bombs and history with them. If you're listening to this and you're already feeling that sense of tension, that idea of something invisible moving toward a city that doesn't know it's coming, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is not just about a plane, it's about a moment when technology and human courage combine to change how wars are fought forever, and in the next part, we are going to move into the night when Baghdad went dark, when the first stealth strikes hit, and when an entire air defense network realized, too late, that it was being hunted by something it could not see. As January 17, 1991, slipped into the early hours of morning in Iraq, Baghdad was still awake, a sprawling city of lights, traffic, and late-night activity, because even though war was expected, daily life had not yet fully stopped, and most people had no idea that in just minutes, their world was about to change forever, and high above them, far beyond anything the human eye could see, a small group of F-117 Nighthawks was already moving silently through the darkness, their black, angular shapes slicing through the air like ghosts, heading straight toward the most heavily defended city in the Middle East. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were focused, calm, and intensely aware of what was at stake, because they were not just flying into enemy territory, they were flying into the core of Saddam Hussein's military power, where radar stations, missile batteries, and anti-aircraft guns were layered on top of each other like a fortress in the sky, and yet, despite all of that, their radar warning receivers were eerily quiet, because the very systems designed to find and kill them were struggling to even notice they were there, and that silence was one of the most unsettling and powerful signs of all, because it meant the stealth technology was working exactly as it was supposed to. Below them, Iraqi radar operators were staring at their screens, waiting for the massive wave of coalition aircraft that intelligence had told them would come, and when the war finally began, they did see activity, conventional aircraft lighting up the edges of their detection ranges, and missile crews preparing to fire, but what they did not see were the F-117s already slipping through gaps in that radar coverage, moving straight toward Baghdad, because to the machines that were supposed to track them, these jets were little more than faint whispers, easily lost in background noise, and that meant the first explosions of the war would not come from the aircraft everyone was watching, but from something far more dangerous, something that had already reached its targets. When the first bombs hit, they did not fall on random buildings or civilian neighborhoods, they struck Iraqi command and control centers, communication hubs, and key military headquarters, places that were supposed to coordinate the country's entire defense, and suddenly, in the middle of the night, huge fireballs erupted across Baghdad, lighting up the skyline, knocking out power, shattering windows, and sending shock waves through the city, and for the Iraqi leadership, the shock was not just that they were being bombed, it was that they had no warning, no alarms, no radar tracks that said the enemy was coming, which meant the heart of their defense system had just been punched without them even knowing where the blow came from. On television screens around the world, people watched in awe as green night vision footage showed explosions bursting across the city, and while it looked dramatic to viewers at home, what it meant in military terms was even more important, because it showed that the coalition was able to strike the most sensitive and protected targets in Iraq right at the start of the war, something that had never been done on this scale before. And at the center of that achievement were the F-117s, flying mission after mission into the same dangerous airspace, hitting targets that would have been suicide runs for any conventional aircraft. Iraqi air defense crews were confused and frustrated, because their missiles were firing, their guns were blazing, but they were shooting at what they could see on radar, and the most important attackers were not showing up clearly at all, which created a terrifying sense of helplessness, because it felt like being attacked by an invisible enemy, one that could strike whenever it wanted and then vanish back into the night. And this psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical destruction, because once you realize you cannot see what is hitting you, fear begins to spread through every level of the defense system. For the pilots in the F-117s, this night was the culmination of years of secret training, because every mission they flew was a test of the technology, their skills, and their nerves, as they navigated through hostile airspace, relying on stealth rather than speed or maneuverability to keep them alive, and when they released their bombs and saw their targets destroyed with pinpoint accuracy, They knew they were witnessing something that would be studied by militaries around the world for decades to come. As Baghdad burned and its air defenses struggled to respond, the message was already clear: the rules of air warfare had changed, and the United States now had a machine that could reach into the most heavily defended cities on Earth and strike with near impunity. And if that doesn't give you chills, it should, because it marked the moment when being unseen became just as powerful as being heavily armed. And in the next part, we are going to dive deeper into those first stealth strikes, the specific missions, the targets they hit, and why they mattered so much in the opening hours of the war. So if you're enjoying this story and you want to hear more about the machines that changed the battlefield, don't forget to like and subscribe, because this is just the beginning of what the F-117 did to Iraq's defenses. As the first waves of explosions rippled through Baghdad, what most people did not realize was that this was not a one-time surprise attack but the opening move of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to blind, confuse, and paralyze an entire nation's ability to fight, because while Iraqi air defense crews were desperately trying to understand what had just happened, more F-117 Nighthawks were already inbound, flying precise routes through the same heavily defended corridors, hitting one critical target after another with a level of accuracy that made it feel as if someone was turning off Iraq's military infrastructure piece by piece like flipping switches in a dark room. And this is where the F-117 stopped being just a technological marvel and became a psychological weapon. Every target those stealth jets struck was chosen for maximum impact, not just in terms of physical destruction but in how it would affect Iraq's ability to coordinate its forces, because modern warfare depends on communication, radar, and command centers, and the F-117 specialized in killing exactly those things, meaning that Iraqi generals were suddenly cut off from their units. Radar operators were losing their feeds, and missile batteries were being left blind and confused, and when you take all of that away at once, even the largest army in the region starts to feel like it is fighting in the dark. What made this even more terrifying for the defenders was that they could not adapt in time, because normally when a new threat appears, you change tactics, you shift radar frequencies, you move missile sites, or you reposition guns, but the F-117 was designed specifically to defeat those adjustments, since its shape and radar-absorbing material scattered and weakened radar signals instead of reflecting them back. So even when Iraqi crews tried new settings or fired blindly into the sky, they were still chasing ghosts, and that sense of being powerless against something you cannot see is one of the fastest ways to break morale. Inside the cockpits, the pilots were flying some of the most intense missions of their careers, because stealth did not mean invincibility. It meant that as long as they flew their routes precisely and followed their procedures perfectly, they had a dramatically higher chance of survival. But one mistake, one wrong turn, or one unexpected radar hit could still put them in danger. And that meant every second of every mission was filled with quiet tension, broken only by the beeps of navigation systems and the moment when the bomb release button was pressed and a target thousands of feet below was suddenly erased from the map. On the ground, Iraqi forces were beginning to realize that something was deeply wrong, because their most protected sites were being hit over and over again, often without warning, and sometimes without even knowing which direction the attack had come from, and this created a sense of inevitability, the feeling that no matter what they did, the Americans could reach them, which is one of the most devastating realizations any military can face, because once you believe the enemy is unstoppable, every decision becomes harder and every risk feels larger. This is why the F-117 was not just another aircraft but a turning point in how wars would be fought, because for the first time, a nation could systematically dismantle another country's ability to fight without first having to destroy its entire air defense network through massive, risky conventional attacks, and that meant fewer pilots lost, fewer planes shot down, and a far more efficient way to dominate the skies. And as news of these strikes spread, both within Iraq and around the world, the reputation of the Nighthawk began to grow into something almost mythical. Even among coalition forces, the F-117 inspired awe, because pilots flying conventional jets knew how dangerous Iraqi airspace was, how thick the radar coverage was, and how lethal the missile batteries could be, and yet the stealth pilots were going straight into the heart of it night after night, hitting the most dangerous targets and coming back unscathed. And that contrast only reinforced the idea that a new era of warfare had arrived, one where technology could tilt the balance so heavily that even a heavily armed enemy could feel naked and exposed. As we move forward, we are going to look at how Iraq tried to respond to this invisible threat, what tactics they attempted, and why none of it was enough to stop the F-117 from continuing to dominate the skies over Baghdad. So if you're fascinated by how a single machine can change the course of a war, make sure you hit that like button and stay subscribed, because this story is only getting more intense from here. By the time the first few nights of bombing had passed, Iraqi commanders were no longer just shocked, they were desperate, because it was now painfully clear that something was slipping through their defenses and hitting the most sensitive parts of their military infrastructure, and even though they could not see the F-117s clearly on radar, they knew those jets were out there, somewhere in the darkness, which meant the next step was not just to keep firing blindly, but to try anything and everything that might give them a chance to bring one down, and that led to a frantic mix of old-school tactics, guesswork, and raw fear. One of the main strategies Iraqi air defense units tried was simply flooding the sky with fire, because if you cannot track a target, the next best thing is to create a wall of explosions and hope something flies into it, and so anti-aircraft guns filled the night with tracer rounds, surface-to-air missiles streaked upward, and the skies over Baghdad became a chaotic storm of light and noise. But for the F-117 pilots, this actually highlighted one of the strengths of stealth, because most of that fire was aimed at conventional aircraft that were visible on radar or at random coordinates, while the stealth jets were slipping quietly through the gaps, their signatures so small that they rarely became the focus of sustained attacks. Iraq also tried to move and hide key assets, relocating radar systems, command posts, and missile batteries in an effort to make them harder to target, but the F-117 was built for exactly this kind of hunt, because its precision-guided munitions allowed it to strike individual buildings, bunkers, and hardened shelters with incredible accuracy, which meant that even when targets were moved, they could still be found and destroyed, and every time that happened, it reinforced the feeling that nowhere was truly safe, not even in the heart of a capital city. What made this even more demoralizing was the timing of the attacks, because the F-117s flew primarily at night, when visibility was low and nerves were already on edge, and when explosions suddenly erupted out of the darkness without warning, it felt almost supernatural to those on the ground, like the city itself was being hunted by something it could not see. And this kind of fear is not just emotional, it affects how people think, how they react, and how they fight, which is why psychological impact is such a powerful part of modern warfare. Meanwhile, inside the stealth squadrons, the missions continued with relentless precision, because the goal was not just to strike once and move on, it was to keep pressure on Iraq's leadership, to keep knocking out their ability to communicate, to coordinate, and to defend, until their entire system began to collapse under the weight of constant, invisible attacks. And this strategy was working far better than anyone had predicted, because Iraqi defenses were not just being destroyed, they were being confused and exhausted, which made them less effective with every passing day. This is also where the reputation of the F-117 really started to spread beyond just military circles, because reporters, analysts, and even enemy forces began talking about these stealth jets as if they were something out of science fiction, planes that could appear out of nowhere, drop bombs with surgical precision, and then vanish back into the night. And for a country that had once prided itself on its air defense network, this was a devastating blow to confidence and credibility. As the days went on and the strikes continued, it became clear that Iraq's attempts to counter the F-117 were not working, and that realization alone was almost as damaging as the bombs themselves, because once you accept that the enemy has a tool you cannot effectively stop, the entire balance of power shifts, and in the next part, we are going to explore just how deep that shift went, and how the dominance of the Nighthawk over Baghdad reshaped the course of the war. So if this story is pulling you in, take a moment to like the video and leave a comment about what you think the most terrifying part of stealth technology really is, because your support helps this channel bring you more stories like this one, where machines and history collide in dramatic ways. By the second week of the air campaign, something remarkable was happening inside Iraq's military, because even in units that had not yet been directly attacked by the F-117, the fear of being attacked was already shaping decisions, movements, and morale, as commanders hesitated to use certain facilities, avoided turning on radars, and sometimes even shut down entire communication networks out of fear that doing so would reveal their position to the invisible jets circling above, and this is one of the most powerful but least visible effects of stealth warfare, because when the enemy is afraid to even use their own systems, you are winning without firing a single shot. The F-117 had effectively turned Iraq's air defense network into a liability, because every radar pulse, every radio transmission, and every active system could potentially make a site a target, and so instead of confidently tracking and engaging aircraft, Iraqi crews were forced into a defensive crouch, constantly weighing whether doing their job might get them killed. And that kind of hesitation spreads like a virus through a military organization, slowing reactions, breaking coordination, and making even well-equipped forces feel helpless and exposed. For the pilots flying the Nighthawk, this psychological dominance was just as important as the physical damage they were doing, because every successful mission, every safe return, and every destroyed target reinforced the idea that their aircraft was not just surviving in hostile airspace, it was owning it, and that confidence allowed them to keep pushing deeper, hitting more sensitive and more heavily defended sites as the campaign went on, which only increased the pressure on Iraq's leadership and military planners. Back in the United States, the public was watching this unfold on nightly news broadcasts, seeing footage of precise strikes and glowing explosions in the dark, and while the technology itself was impressive, what really captured people's imagination was the idea that American pilots were flying straight into danger and coming back unharmed, thanks to a machine that had been developed in near total secrecy for years. And this combination of bravery and innovation became a powerful symbol of how far U.S. military technology had come. Inside Iraq, however, that same story was being experienced very differently, because to soldiers and civilians alike, the F-117 felt like an unstoppable force, something that could strike any building, any headquarters, any bunker at any time, and that sense of constant vulnerability wears people down in a way that no single massive bombing raid ever could, because there is no relief, no safe moment, and no clear way to fight back. As the air campaign continued, the coalition began to gain complete control of the skies, and while many factors contributed to that dominance, the F-117 played a crucial role by taking out the most dangerous and important targets early on, allowing other aircraft to operate with far less risk. And this teamwork between stealth and conventional forces is what allowed the United States and its allies to maintain an overwhelming advantage throughout the war. In the next part, we are going to look at some of the specific missions that became legendary, the targets that were considered nearly impossible to hit, and how the F-117 managed to destroy them anyway. So if you're hooked on this story, make sure you stay with us by subscribing and hitting that like button, because these are the moments that truly show why this machine changed the course of modern warfare. As the Gulf War air campaign moved forward, some F-117 missions began to stand out not just for their success, but for how bold and almost unbelievable they seemed on paper, because these stealth jets were being sent against targets that had been considered some of the most protected locations in Iraq, including hardened bunkers, underground command centers, and government buildings in the very heart of Baghdad. And the fact that these strikes kept succeeding only deepened the sense that the Nighthawk was operating on an entirely different level from any aircraft that had come before it. One of the most famous types of targets the F-117 was tasked with destroying were Iraq's hardened command bunkers, which were built to survive conventional bombing and keep the country's leadership connected even during heavy attacks, and these bunkers were often buried under thick layers of concrete and earth, protected by multiple rings of air defenses. But the F-117's precision-guided bombs could be guided straight into ventilation shafts or small openings, allowing them to penetrate deep inside and neutralize facilities that would have required dozens of bombs from conventional aircraft. And when those bunkers went silent, it was not just a tactical victory, it was a symbolic one, because it meant Iraq's ability to coordinate the war was being ripped apart from the inside. Another set of targets that made headlines were government buildings and military headquarters in downtown Baghdad, places that were not only important strategically but also highly visible, and when these structures were hit with pinpoint accuracy, often with minimal damage to surrounding areas, it sent a powerful message to Iraq's leadership and to the world, showing that the United States could strike exactly what it wanted, exactly when it wanted, even in the middle of a major city, and that level of control is one of the most intimidating things any military can demonstrate. For the Iraqi population, these precise strikes created a strange and unsettling atmosphere, because while large parts of the city remained intact, specific buildings would suddenly be destroyed in dramatic fashion, which made it feel as if some invisible hand was reaching down from the sky to select targets at will, and that feeling of being watched and targeted is one of the deepest forms of fear, because it suggests that no matter where you are, someone knows, and someone can reach you. Inside the cockpits of the F-117s, the pilots were acutely aware of how extraordinary their missions were, because they were flying alone or in very small groups, deep into enemy territory, relying almost entirely on their aircraft's stealth and their own precision to survive, and when they released their weapons and saw their targets vanish, they were not just completing another sortie, they were proving that a completely new way of fighting wars was not just possible, but devastatingly effective. By this point in the war, the reputation of the Nighthawk had spread far beyond Iraq, because militaries around the world were watching closely, taking notes, and realizing that the era of relying solely on radar and missile defenses to protect important targets was coming to an end, and that realization would go on to influence defense planning, aircraft design, and military strategy for decades. In the final part of this story, we are going to look at what the F-117's success in Baghdad meant for the future of warfare, how it changed the way battles are fought, and why this strange, angular jet still holds such an important place in military history. So if you've enjoyed this journey through one of the most dramatic chapters of modern air combat, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe, because this channel is all about telling the stories behind the machines that made enemies panic. When the guns finally fell silent after the Gulf War, the world was left with a new understanding of what air power could look like, because the F-117 Nighthawk had not just helped win a conflict, it had changed the rules of the game, proving that stealth, precision, and information dominance could be just as decisive as raw numbers and firepower, and in the skies over Baghdad. That lesson had been written in fire and shadow, as one of the most heavily defended cities on Earth was repeatedly struck by an aircraft it could barely detect, let alone stop. Military planners everywhere took notice, because what the Nighthawk demonstrated was that you no longer needed to overwhelm an enemy with massive waves of bombers and fighters just to break through their defenses. Instead, a small number of stealth aircraft, flying carefully planned missions, could cripple an entire system by hitting its most important nodes, and that efficiency was not just about saving money or equipment. It was about saving lives, because fewer aircraft flying into danger meant fewer pilots at risk, which is one of the most meaningful measures of success in any military operation. For the pilots who flew the F-117, the war was a defining moment in their careers, because they had taken a machine that many people still barely understood and proven its worth in the most intense environment imaginable, and while they rarely sought the spotlight, their work became part of a larger story about how technology, training, and courage can come together to create something truly transformative. And that combination is at the heart of so many American military achievements. Iraq, on the other hand, was left with a shattered air defense network and a deep awareness of how vulnerable even a well-equipped military could be when faced with a technological leap it could not match, and that realization did not just affect the outcome of the Gulf War, it influenced how countries around the world began thinking about defense, deterrence, and the future of conflict, because no one wanted to be on the receiving end of an invisible enemy ever again. The F-117 would eventually be retired, replaced by newer and even more advanced stealth aircraft, but its place in history is secure, because it was the first to prove that stealth was not just a theoretical advantage, it was a battlefield reality, and the fear it created in the skies over Baghdad is part of what gave rise to the modern era of air warfare, where being unseen can be just as deadly as being heavily armed. And this brings us back to the heart of this series, the machines that made enemies panic, because the Nighthawk did not just destroy targets, it destroyed the sense of security that Iraq's defenses were built on, showing that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that makes the biggest explosion, but the one that makes the enemy realize they can no longer hide. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most fascinating machines in military history, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment with what machine you think we should cover next, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story where technology and warfare collide in unforgettable ways.